Push Scholars, Mr. Beamer here. We're doing something a little bit different. We're going to have me talk with background music. This music is from The Natural. Listen to it. It fires me up. The Natural came, oops, where'd it go? The Natural came out the mid-1980s about baseball. I love the movie The Natural. Fires me up. So here you go. This is chapter 36. Do not quit on me. Do not quit. We're almost there. Listen. Inspirational music. I love it. We're going to talk about the New Deal and the Great Depression. And Beamer, why is this music so uplifting to the Depression? But you know what? We're talking about somebody very special to me, my number 2 president. There he is. I like Lincoln more, but FDR, the number 2 president, in my opinion, I love him. He brought hope, confidence, and he brought America out of the Great Depression. Listen. Wait, hang on. Crescendo. We're going to crescendo. Crescendo. There it is. Fire up. FDR, the New Deal. Here we go. Wow. You know, I like the music background. Now it's going to be me talking. Wow. Fire up for that. All right. We got a lot of stuff to cover in the first half of chapter 36. The second half is not near as long. So a lot of stuff about FDR. This is information about his background. And so he does win the 1932 election over Herbert Hoover. We'll look at that a little bit later. A little bit of his background, he was stricken with polio in 1921, so he's pretty much paralyzed from his waist down. He was in a wheelchair the last 25 years of his life. I want you to know his wife's name, Eleanor Roosevelt, one of the greatest first ladies, maybe the most active first lady in American history. And she was so important to FDR, and FDR was an amazing politician, and he was liked by most people. He had a way of speaking. Most of our better politicians definitely are good speakers. His most famous quote is probably the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. I know you probably know that, and so that's what he'll be remembered for, and also for getting us out of World War II. All right, the question is, what is his greatest presidential achievement? Is it helping us get out of the Great Depression, or is it overcoming the Nazis and the Japanese in World War II? It's definitely debatable. I include the next section, just a little bit about FDR again, in the 1932 election. So going into this election, 1932, ironically enough, FDR and the Democrats were attacking Hoover's spending. They said he spent too much, especially on the Hoover Dam and the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, which is so ironic because when FDR takes over the Democrats, they are going to spend. They're going to go deep in debt. So again, this is a political move just so they could beat Hoover in the election. Also, one of the famous quotes around FDR's campaign is "Happy days are here again," because he was going to restore hope. Something that was not very hopeful was the unemployment rate. In 1932, 1933 was an all-time high. I want you to know this, 25%. So 1 out of 4 Americans were without a job by 1933, the worst year of the Great Depression. Alliteration, the humiliation of Hoover, the election of 1932. FDR destroys Hoover 472 to 59 in the Electoral College. Really, Hoover had no chance. No matter who the Democrat put in as their candidate, the Democratic candidate was going to win. And fortunately for FDR, he was their candidate. So look at the map. Again, it's all FDR. Hoover does win in the Northeast. He does also get Pennsylvania, but otherwise it is a sweep for FDR. Also noteworthy, this election was the transition period when African Americans are leaving the Republican Party to go to the Democratic Party. In early 2000, African Americans, over 90% are going to vote for Democrats. And so this transition begins in the 1930s and into the 1940s. Southern whites were still voting for the Democrats in this election, but by the 50s, Southern whites are going to the Republican Party. Also after this election, the lame duck period between the election and the inauguration was shortened by 2 months. Most of us know that the inauguration for the presidents was in March, but today it's January 20th. So typically it's just a 2-month lame duck period. And the reason for shortening the lame duck period is mostly because of this election. After FDR won the election, for 4 months, Hoover had no power and the Depression worsened. And so we shortened it to 2 months so the president-elect can start the presidency sooner. All right, there he is in all of his splendor. FDR, love you so much. All right, this is his program. It was called the New Deal, and most of you know that FDR's programs to get us out of the Great Depression were his New Deal, and there are 3 parts to his New Deal programs: relief, recovery, and reform. The 3 R's. I would probably know this. What does this mean? Basically, he wanted to provide relief for the people that are starving and struggling right now to get them out of their misery. Second is to recover the economy, to get it going again, to end the high unemployment and to end the depression. And the final R is reform. FDR wanted to put laws in place to prevent another depression from happening. And since 1930s, we have not had a depression in the United States up to the year 2015. I hope it continues for a long time. All right, so one of the first things FDR does is he calls for a banking holiday. Highlight this. Basically, the federal government shut down all the banks in the United States for a few days. And so what happened is the federal government went into every bank and inspected their finances. And if they were in good financial shape, the banks were allowed to open. And if they were not in good shape, the government would keep them closed. And this was huge because it provided confidence for people in the banks. All right, finally, I would highlight this term, the first 100 days, and this refers to FDR's first 100 days as president, and it's significant because Congress passed dozens and dozens of laws to try to get the United States out of the Depression, and so this is a sign of FDR being very, very active, okay, and he was going to do something to try to get us out of the Depression. Many of the things did not work, but it was a very active period in Congress. All right, so FDR tackles money and banking, and so the first thing here, the Emergency Banking Relief Act, gave the government more power to regulate banking transactions. So the government is getting more power, especially over banks. Also, FDR gives many of his fireside chats, and so he gives dozens of these talks over the radio to the American people, and so the American people, for the first time, really heard the president's voice often, and FDR tried to give them hope that things are going to get better. So the fireside chats, FDR goes on the radio to talk to the American people. All right, I need to highlight these two things here in the middle, the Glass-Steagall Banking Reform Act and the FDIC. So this law created this government agency called the FDIC. It's very important. It insured, back then in 1933, up to $5,000 of people's money. So if your bank went out of business, our government would give you your money back up to $5,000. So it was an insurance on the banks. And the biggest thing this did was prevent bank runs. So banks really did not fail hardly at all. And we'll look at that right now, or at the end of this slide. We'll look at how few banks closed after this was passed. Final thing is FDR took the nation off the gold standard except for international transactions, a little bit of currency stuff. And so I would just know that FDR was changing the currency issue slightly. Eventually, Richard Nixon is the president that takes us completely off the gold standard. So FDR's goal was to encourage inflation and to get prices to go up. If prices go up, people in debt, especially farmers, can start to pay off their debt. So that's why he took us partially off the gold standard. All right, and finally, this visual shows the bank failures from 1920 to the 1930s. And obviously, if you notice, in the 1920s, the bank failures increased dramatically. We know the stock market crashed in October of 1929. So in the 30s, dramatic increases in bank failures. 33, again, probably the worst year of the Great Depression. Over 4,000 banks failed. But after the passage of the Glass-Steagall Act and the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, after the FDIC, the bank failures dropped dramatically thanks to FDR. All right, more action from FDR, creating jobs for the jobless. So FDR created numerous programs, and a lot of these are called the alphabet agencies. Okay, so these are a lot of the programs that had 3 or 4 letter names, and they were designed to improve conditions for the public. The most famous one is probably the CCC. I would highlight this, the Civilian Conservation Corps. Basically, it gave millions of young, unmarried men a chance to get a job, and they were paid $1 a day. Most of the jobs were planting trees, repairing roads, building bridges. So think of trees when you think of this group, and it gave men a chance to have a job and to be outside and to work and not be unemployed. So this was one of probably most famous New Deal program. Another one, the AAA, you need to know this one, the Agricultural Adjustment Act. It helped farmers meet their mortgages, is what it tried to do. And we'll talk about the AAA a little bit later in the video, but basically, we'll go in detail, but it paid farmers to not grow crops, seriously. The CWA, the Civilian Works Administration, I'm not going to have you know that one. The WPA, I would highlight this one, the Works Progress Administration, another New Deal program that was designed to give jobs to people, especially men, building bridges and roads. It gave 9 million people jobs. And so the difference between the WPA and the CCC was for unmarried men. Really think of planting trees. WPA was for unmarried and married men building roads and bridges. The last thing I would highlight, the most popular of the New Deal programs, we'll talk about a lot more in the future, is the CCC. The most complex is the NRA. We'll get to that later. That has nothing to do with rifles. And the most radical is the TVA, Tennessee Valley Authority. We'll get to that in a little bit. All right, continuing this section, you need to know these three people. These are three critics or opponents of FDR. Obviously, Republicans were strongly against FDR, but these were three very special people, and these three were called demagogues. Demagogues is not a positive term and not a positive connotation. They're basically people that are great speakers that try to play on people's fear to make change. You could call demagogues manipulators and like rabble rousers, getting people fired up. So the three you need to know. Father Charles Coughlin, he was a radio voice. He was a Catholic priest, and he was very anti-Semitic, so he was against Jews, and he called for social justice, though, for more equality. Huey Long, you need to know him. He was a senator from Louisiana, and his idea was called Share the Wealth, and wanted to give people $5,000 from the wealthy, so he was more of a socialist. His viewpoints, take from the wealthy, give everybody $5,000 so they could spend it. And the last one is Dr. Francis Townsend. He was concerned about elderly people, okay, trying to help elderly people, senior citizens, give them $200 a month. Basically, they had to spend that $200 to get the economy going again. This is a very expensive idea, but he was looking for it to help the old people. But this is like a precursor, if you will, to Social Security, which is how we try to help the elderly today. One of the most famous demagogues in American history happened in the 1950s around the Red Scare, the second Red Scare, 1950s. Anybody? His first name was Joseph McCarthy, probably the most famous demagogue besides these three. Wow, a lot of New Deal stuff. Another New Deal program that you need to know, the NRA, the National Recovery Administration, the most complicated program. Basically, it was designed to assist industry, labor, and the unemployed. And actually, the Philadelphia Eagles football team was named after this act because the symbol of the NRA was an eagle. Okay, and what it tried to do was provide a maximum of hours of labor to workers, also more minimum wage laws being passed, and the rights, give more rights to labor union members. So the NRA was designed to give more help to the poor, especially labor factory workers. Later, it was declared unconstitutional. I think this is the most important thing you need to know about the NRA. The Supreme Court ruled it unconstitutional, so the NRA could no longer exist. The Supreme Court later struck down another New Deal program, the AAA, as well. Last thing, a little bit off topic, Prohibition was officially repealed, the 21st Amendment. Highlight this in 1933. So the Prohibition Amendment was the 18th Amendment, and then 14 years later, the Congress and the United States people passed the 21st Amendment to officially end Prohibition in 1933. I mentioned the AAA, the Agricultural Adjustment Administration, and highlight this one. And basically, our government paid farmers to reduce their crops, the amount of land that they create crops from, and also reduce their surplus. So basically, we paid farmers to not grow crops. This is going to eliminate overproduction, which hopefully would cause farm prices to rise. All right, this law initially does create actually more unemployment, and there were some other negatives. Our government purchased and slaughtered millions of squealing pigs. Some of the meat was used to feed the starving, but a lot of it was wasted, used for fertilizer. And so, again, some people had serious problems with the AAA. The idea of having farmers not grow crops when people were starving upset a lot of people. But this was killed by the Supreme Court as well. So the two laws struck down by the Supreme Court were the NRA, National Recovery Administration, and the AAA. And FDR does not like the Supreme Court because of this. And later, in the 1930s, he tries to do something about it. He tries to pack the court. I bet you remember from 10th grade history, dust bowls and black blizzards, and so farmers had it terrible in the 1930s. It was not good in the 1920s either for farmers, and then in the Great Depression in the 1930s, it was miserable. So major drought in the 30s created terrible conditions, especially in the Great Plains, in the Midwest Great Plains, and the causes of these black blizzards were the drought, poor farming methods, the farmers did not rotate crops, and the high winds caused these terrible black blizzards. A famous book, I would highlight this book, John Steinbeck's The Grapes of Wrath. Perhaps you've read this book, was written in 1939. It describes how farmers in the Dust Bowl region, and I'll put a map up in a second, how their lives were unbearable, and they were forced to move west to California. Many of these people, especially around Oklahoma, moved to California, a terrible livelihood in the Dust Bowl region. Slightly off topic from the Dust Bowl was Indians, Native Americans. They did get a new law passed. I would highlight that's very important, the Indian Reorganization Act of 1934. And basically this law reversed the Dawes Act. Okay, so it's cause and effect. This happened, and then bad things happened to Native Americans. Their lands were reduced, forced assimilation. So FDR helps pass the Indian Reorganization Act, which ends the forced assimilation of the Dawes Act. This is also sometimes called the Indian New Deal. There he is, Gordon Gekko, GG from Wall Street. He is all about big business, wealth, and power. And our government creates a new agency in 1933 called the SEC, the Securities Exchange Commission. And this job, this government agency, is to watch people like Gordon Gekko and to prevent stock market fraud, to prevent big business fraud. And so that's their job, to protect the people, to protect the consumers. And this was created by FDR's New Deal, and it also was in response to the stock market crash of 1929. So the SEC, Securities Exchange Commission, is still around today to prevent bank stock market corruption. All right, the final slide for today is the TVA, the Tennessee Valley Authority harnesses the Tennessee River. We got a map here. This is Tennessee and the surrounding states, and this blue, these lines are the Tennessee River and its tributaries. And basically these little red dots here are a bunch of dams. These dams were created along the Tennessee River and the tributaries, and the point of these dams was to provide electricity for the South. The South was so poor in the 1920s and 1930s, they had no industry, they had very little electricity, and so the TVA was designed to provide electricity for the South, and this has definitely helped the South boom today. Cities such as Atlanta and Birmingham are very much growing. A lot of it due to the Tennessee Valley Authority. And so like I mentioned, it constructed hydroelectric power on these dams in the Tennessee River, and it was, I would highlight, it's one of the most successful New Deal programs, but it was quite radical. Okay, it is somewhat socialistic, where the government is actually like kind of taking over industry, trying to help the people in the South. The government was getting very involved, but this was very beneficial, especially today, for the people in the South.